Now, outside a small but vocal and rather intimidating demonstration by trans activists who were hurling racist and misogynistic abuse at arriving delegates, much of it rather too vile to repeat, but some of the less vile, or at least repeatable. What kind of man would you want? What kind of man would want you? A blind man? Hang your head in shame, slave master, yes, slave master. These were some of the less expletive-ridden abuse that was shouted at arriving delegates. Well, inside, it was a rather more pleasant affair. More than 400 people, mostly women, many of them new to the subject, met to hear a range of speakers, included Francis Crook from the Howard League, or just recently stood down from the Howard League as the long-standing chief executive there, Lucy Baldwin from De Montfort University. I mentioned briefly Lucy's presentation in the previous item. The actress Frances Barber read out a series of very moving testimonies from serving and former female prisoners. Jo Phoenix with us today, we'll come back to that in a second, and the Labour MP Rosie Duffield, who reminded audience of the backgrounds of violence, abuse and poverty of most imprisoned women. So it was really, for me, I think a very significant event, a huge number of people there, possibly the largest event there's ever been on women's imprisonment matters. I can't think of a larger one. And perhaps another sign of the resurgent feminist movement in this country, which is much welcome. Jo, you were one of the speakers, possibly one of the star turns, dare I say, and you gave an absolutely barnstorming speech covering a number of issues, including the whole question about sex-based rights and sex-based protection for female prisoners. It was a week ago. Would you like to maybe share some reflections a week on from that event about about the event? And
I've been asking old friends, and when I say old friends, I mean people who are older than me, as opposed to long-lived friends, as to whether or not it really was the largest live collection event, if you like, about women in prison. And so far, the people that I've asked cannot remember any incident where so many people gathered from the general public. It is the case that there have been plenaries at conferences that may have attracted that many speakers, but then of course that's a slightly different thing, isn't it? Because that's, professionals all talking. This was wide open. There's like three things that I want to say about this, and I'm happy if you guys want to. I don't really want to talk about myself, right? So I'm going to give other reflections, and then I may say something just a little bit about myself and my experience of that. To me, one of the most painful speeches to listen to was Lucy Baldwin's. Now, she was telling us that, and I don't mean this in any patronizing way at all. It's actually a mark of respect. She was telling us that which we already know, right? It's not hard to draw the conclusion that actually if there are mothers in prison, there are children who are going to suffer as a result, because we know that mothers do the bulk of the childcare, right? So we know that. So of course it's going to have a deleterious effect on women, and it's going to have a deleterious effect on children and wider families. We can draw that conclusion. But because Lucy's research gave us the quotes, gave us the first-hand experience, and because she is as impassioned a speaker as she was, there were moments in her talk where I was literally struggling not to cry, because it was so gut-wrenching, so gut-wrenching. And of course that raised to me another question, and that's, how do we as academics actually convey some of this material? Because it's very easy to go for those gut-wrenching stories, but also then forget that some of the people who are listening, I don't mean this in the kind of 21st century young people's kind of way of thinking, but some of the people who are listening may have had experiences similar to that. We have to remember that when we talk, we carry with us the burden of the people that we have researched, but also some of the burden and responsibility of the audience. And I thought Lucy got it bang on. I really did. So that to me was an astonishing talk, and I would encourage anyone who's at the who's at this webinar today to keep an eye out for when WP UK posts that video. It's important. Frances Barber was extraordinary. She read the words out of serving and former female prisoners. She did it with a light touch and in a way that actually drove a lot of the points home from those selected excerpts. The other thing that I want to just kind of pause on here for a second is that whole question about, is this the resurgence of feminism in the 21st century? We were talking before we went live about, you know, the fact that there's an awful lot happening about women at the moment. Not to put, you know, any more details on it. We've got a lot about violence against women, policing, you know, the inspection reports, women's places not in prison. And from my point of view, and if I'm going to say anything personal, this is where I'm going to say it. I think what we're really seeing at the moment is a split between the growth of a grassroots feminism, people out in the world who are witnessing these things, struggling with them, trying to figure out how to deal with the effects of sex-based inequality in our lives, and feminism in the academy. Because as many people here will know, feminism in the academy is almost taking two divergent paths. You know, there's some feminism which is like, you know, if I am a feminist scholar, if I am a gender critical scholar, my scholarship is moving much more around, you know, defining women, you know, in terms of sex-based rights, in terms of biology. But there are other feminisms out there that are talking much more about identity and gender identity. And there is, I mean, everybody knows Kathleen Stock today has been on Women's Hour. We know what happened to her at Sussex University. Many of the listeners today, participants, will know what has been happening with me. And yeah, actually, I've just talked myself out. I've talked myself into a dead end.
No, thank you, Jo. I mean, you were very modest about not wanting to talk about yourself, which you know is you know right a problem. And I do want to just press you on one point, which is, I mean, I think you made a very strong case in your speech that it was not transphobic for female prisoners not to want to have male prisoners.
Yeah.
When I say male prisoners, I'm talking about biologically male, people who were born male, who then identify as women. It was reasonable for them not to want to have to share their spaces with those prisoners, whatever those male prisoners might feel about themselves. And this is, as you know, and you know only too well, is a very toxic and challenging issue. I just want to kind of read a tweet here. So this event, when we were publicizing this event over the last 2 weeks, one of our tweets was retweeted. I'm not going to name the person, but what they described in their retweet, they described, you know, the suggestion that, you know, it might not be unreasonable for female prisoners not to want to have males in their spaces as a terrible trans-hating position that should be widely condemned. If your anti-punishment politics are anti-trans, then they are absolutely pointless because they actively recreate the degrading, denying, and marginalizing conditions they claim to be challenging. Shameful. What do you think of that, Jo? Yeah, what's your response?
All right, I'm going to throw out a term of art. I think that is conceptual imperialism, right? Taking the struggles of one, transplanting it, and taking over the struggles of another group. You know, we know all sorts of reasons why women, you know, that within female prisons, why people who are born women, natal women, may not want male-bodied individuals around, right? We know, for instance, that there is a much higher percentage of women who are incarcerated who have come from backgrounds of male violence, whether it's sex or abusive, you know, kind of emotional abuse or physical abuse. We also know that there's a really perverse effect of women going to prison, and that's that they often actually have a break from some of the violence that they experience at the hands of their brothers, fathers, partners, and so on. We know this. We know this so much that back in the early 2000s, I think it was South Carolina, possibly North Carolina, were trialing a system whereby women, when they left prison, had to stay in women-only refuges, right? Afterwards, hostels, in effect, whilst they got their life on, back on track. So we know this. It's not hard. It's really not hard. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that when we're talking about transgender identifying males in a female prison estate, we could be talking about people who have a GRC, who may or may not have had any medical interventions, any surgical interventions, right? And we could be talking about men who identify as transgender without a GRC, and who may or may not have had any surgical interventions or any medical interventions. So we can be talking about, and I hate to use this language because it's a little bit graphic, but we are talking about men still with penises, with beards, who are still 6'3", and nothing is going to take away from that empirical reality of seeing somebody who's much larger, who is male, in a space that is intimate. Now, we know this as well, and cut me off, Richard, when I need to be cut off here, but we know this as well from the judicial review that recently has published its findings. And the judges in that judicial review said it wasn't transphobic for women to recognize and to say that they didn't want to share their space with men. That it just wasn't, it couldn't be. Because of course, what we're asking of those women in prison is that they give up intimate space. And it's not like, sitting in a cafe when somebody can get up and leave if they don't like the look of, we may not like that people don't like the look of others, but that's part of just being a normal human. It's in the range of human experiences. In a cafe, you can get up and go. But what we are asking, what our government is asking of this particular group of women, is that they share intimate space, daily living space, perhaps even showers, perhaps the gym, with people who they may not want to share that with, right? And I'll stop there. I believe the video of that talk is going up online sometime tomorrow, I think.
Yes, they're all being released this week, and we'll certainly share the links to where you can find those. There's a question here from, it's a kind of a question stroke statement, but I wanted to read it from an anonymous attendee. Yeah. I have been in prison with trans prisoners, one of which was transferred to Low Newton Women's Prison, and it was actually disagreement from male prisoners that stopped this. Do you think the trans issue is watering down the impact on women's issues? Now, I don't want to kind of this whole segment just to be about trans issues, because the event itself was indeed, trans issues were only kind of one aspect of a much richer and wider discussion that evening. Hannah, you attended, so I don't know whether you want to pick up either that point made by anonymous attendee or not. I mean, I think we can just, yes, that's an interesting question, and thank you for sharing that thought, anonymous attendee. And, but Hannah, you may or may not want to pick up on that, and just maybe other kind of general reflections you might have on what Jo said and on the event itself.
Yes, thank you. I'll come back to that point in a moment, if I may. I found Lucy's presentation astonishing. It's not the kind of research I do, and yes, at one level I knew women in prison with children. I mean, I'm not instinctively a prison abolitionist either, but it was incredibly visceral and painful to listen to, and did exactly what good research should do, which was made me question my own views and assumptions. And that's what we need to do. We can't just sit here with talking shops and all saying, oh yes, this is terrible. I think it was such profound research. It made me really go and think about a lot of issues, and not just very sort of sentimentalist, which I think that there's a danger sometimes just telling one person's story can be. I think the examples were chosen so carefully that they really illustrated something that anybody who is policy making should be thinking about. So in that sense it was outstanding research. I think this actually draws together quite a number of the themes that we've talked about today, in terms of what are we going to do next. We've talked about these reviews that have been set up by the police and statistics that have been collected, but where are we going with this? And many of the people who are challenging the police and criticizing the police for their actions or inactions or prison policy making, and I'm talking in particular about in politics and in academia, we need to think about our actions as well. It's very easy to throw stones at other institutions. Jo has been too modest to talk about her own work, but the fact that an academic, and also Kathleen Stock's experience, that an academic could be in fear of losing their job for doing what they should be doing. We are in a very, very privileged position as academics in that we can look at what's going on, we can research, we can ask difficult questions. That if a woman in prison who challenges the fact that a male-bodied prison is there with her, that she is subject to sanction for being transphobic, she is in no position to challenge these things. As academics, I think we have a responsibility to be able to ask the hard questions. And as academics, we should be supporting each other in doing that, whether we agree with each other or not. And Jo's fundraiser and the fact the issues she was talking about at the Women's Place meeting, I think raise a very important issue about whether academia is a place that's allowing particularly feminist scholars to ask difficult questions at the moment, but also Rosie Duffield, who came along, and the experience she has had with the, beyond lack of support from the Labour Party, the idea that an MP is too frightened to attend their own party conference is a scandal. And when I hear politicians or commentators saying, we will do everything to challenge violence against women and girls, we come back to the questioner's point. If we cannot identify accurately who are women and girls, then we can't describe the problem in the way that Lucy's research did so powerfully, and we can't actually build any way of tackling these inequalities, not just for women and girls also, but for trans people in prison too. We need accurate data to describe their experiences and support that they need. And some of the loudest voices shouting in this debate and refusing to allow stories to be told or alternative viewpoints to be put forward are doing a grave disservice to women and girls who are suffering, to trans people, to politics, and from a selfish point of view, to academia as well. And I think we need to do something about that. And hopefully Jo's case is another part of challenging that.
Hannah, thank you. I find it difficult, and forgive me, Richard, I know that we need to move on, but I'd like to just say two small things. I do find it difficult to talk about what's happening, partly because of just modesty, but I also find it difficult to talk about it because I can't quite believe it. Do you know what I mean? It's been 3 years now that this stuff is going on, and yet I can't quite believe where we've got to. The other thing that I want to kind of raise and say is that panel that were there, Alison Bailey chaired it. Alison Bailey is having to bring a legal, case because, what happened to her in her own chambers. Rosie Duffield has had problems with the Labour Party. There's been me. Lucy Baldwin, I suspect she hasn't had problems because of the viscerality of what she does. But, even you, Hannah, have been brought into a lot of these problems, and Richard, CCJS has. And yet what we're trying to achieve is just some clarity. That's all. There was one statistic that was mentioned, I think it was by Lucy, it might have been by Frances, I can't remember who, that said about the astonishing proportion of the number of women who are in prison who have head injuries, right? Now, I wrote a letter to the Lancet psychiatrist, myself and a number of others, because in point of fact, the 104 people that were included in that sample, or the 112, I can't remember exactly, included something like 6 transgender women. And we're like, this can't happen. You've defined it as women, and yet you're including this proportion of people in. Now, although that letter was accepted to the editor, it was then rejected on the grounds that actually it was too few people to count and it didn't hit the scientific significance. Now, the question I'm just going to raise is, at what point do we say, actually, the adulteration of the sample is such that it compromises the scientific knowledge? You know, in this case, it was, I think it was like 5 or 7%. Is 20% okay? Is 80% okay? We don't know, and we have no yardsticks for this. And if we don't have that accurate data, then we're in a world of pain, you know, and as you've rightly said, for trans people as much as for women, as much as for men. That's all.
Thank you, Joe and Hannah, for those really interesting thoughts. We've had a few more comments in the Q&A. Anonymous Attendee, I think, posing the important question about, you know, the whole, not all officers, you know, not all officers are the problem, but as they kind of finish off saying, not all men, not all officers, but how do we know which ones? And, you know, this is a kind of a central question. One of our panel may want to offer a written response to anonymous attendee, and thank you for asking that. There's a question there also from Sam Cowie. I hope, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your name, Sam, my apologies, which I think possibly Hannah might be responding to. And also one from Sally Shepherd. Again, maybe one of our panelists might want to respond to that if there's time. Before we just conclude this item, I just want to go back to some of the intimidation that the attendees faced going into an event which frankly was completely unacceptable. 2 of the demonstrators were later identified as being members of the Socialist Worker Party, which, whilst they have not exactly condemned the action, they have at least said that they're going to investigate the actions of their members. But I just wanted to leave you on this item, at least, with an observation by Lindsay German, who until relatively recently was a very senior figure within the Socialist Worker Party, left it a few years back. And she wrote a piece on the Counterfire website, which again, we can share the details of that. And in conclusion, this is what Lindsay German said: let's be clear here, gender critical women are not fascists. They are mostly left-wing. They should be allowed to organize as women without being abused and intimidated. And if you think that by doing otherwise is helping fight oppression, you really are in a bad place. This has to stop. The only people it is damaging is the left.